Welcome back, deep divers, ready to plunge into some serious international relations theory.
Always up for a challenge.
All right, well, today we're going to be tackling offensive realism.
Ah, yes. A fascinating, if somewhat controversial, perspective.
That's putting it mildly. I mean, the name itself, offensive realism, kind of sounds like a recipe for, well, conflict.
It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But maybe not as aggressive as you might initially think. At its core, offensive realism argues that the international system is, fundamentally, anarchic.
Anarchic. So, like, total chaos, every country for itself.
Well, not exactly chaos, but the idea is that there's no global government, no ultimate authority to enforce rules or protect states. So yeah, in a sense, each country is largely on its own.
Okay, I'm starting to see why it's called offensive realism. Sounds like a pretty cutthroat world out there.
It's definitely a self-help system, that's for sure. And because states are constantly worried about their survival, offensive realism says the best way to guarantee that survival is to become the most powerful player in your region.
So, like the top dog, always got to be one step ahead.
Exactly. And that sometimes means, unfortunately, using force or acting in ways that others might perceive as aggressive. Hence the offensive part.
I see. It's kind of like if you want to stay safe in a dangerous neighborhood, you got to be the toughest guy on the block. Not
Right.
necessarily starting fights, but ready to win them.
That's a pretty good analogy. And one of the leading thinkers in this area is John-Mearsheimer, a political scientist who laid out a lot of the groundwork for offensive realism.
Ah, Mearsheimer. I've heard that name before. Didn't he write a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics?
That's the one, a real classic in the field.
So in that book, and in his work in general, Mearsheimer uses this term potential hegemon. What exactly does that mean?
Well, a potential hegemon is a state that has the capacity to become the dominant power in its region. They've got the resources, the military might, and the ambition to really call the shots.
So like the big fish in the pond.
Precisely. And understanding this concept is crucial for analyzing how international relations really work. We can look at history through this lens and see examples of potential hegemons, think Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan before World War II, or the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Wow, yeah, those are some pretty major players. And those examples, it really makes you wonder, who are the potential hegemons in the world today? And what does that mean for the future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll definitely be exploring further as we delve deeper into this theory.
Now, Mearsheimer also talks about how other states react when they see a potential hegemon on the rise. And he describes two main strategies, balancing and buck passing.
Right. So balancing is essentially what it sounds like. You form alliances, build up your military, all to counter that rising power, trying to maintain a balance of power and prevent one state from becoming too dominant.
Okay, makes sense. So it's kind of like a team effort to keep things in check. But what about buck passing? Does that mean just hoping someone else will deal with the problem?
You got it. It's a more passive approach. A state that's buck passing tries to avoid confronting the potential hegemon directly, and instead hopes that another state will step up and do the heavy lifting.
Sounds a little risky, to be honest. Are there any historical examples of buck passing, and did it, actually work?
Well, one example is the U.S. before World War I. For the most part, the U.S. stayed out of European conflicts, figuring the European powers would kind of balance each other out.
So they were just sitting back watching the show.
Pretty much. But as we know, that strategy didn't exactly prevent a major war. In fact, some argue it may have even contributed to it.
Interesting. So it seems like geography might play a role in whether a state decides to balance or buck pass.
Yeah.
Would a country with natural barriers, like surrounded by oceans, be more likely to try buck passing? Figuring they've got some extra protection?
That's a sharp observation. Geography is definitely a key factor. States with natural defenses might feel more secure and therefore more tempted to buck pass, assuming they have a buffer zone. The U.S., throughout much of the 19th century, is a good example.
How so?
Well, back then, the U.S. was focused on consolidating its power in the Western Hemisphere, building up its influence in the Americas, but it largely stayed out of European affairs, essentially buck passing in Europe while pursuing regional hegemony closer to home.
It's interesting to think about that in the context of today's world. Is the U.S. still an offshore balancer? Or has the rise of new global powers like China changed the game, forcing them into a more active role?
Now, that's a question at the heart of a lot of current foreign policy debates. The world is changing, and the rise of China in particular is shifting the balance of power, especially in Northeast Asia.
Yeah, China is definitely a major player on the world stage these days. And with that shift in power, we're seeing a lot of debate about how the U.S. should respond. Some folks argue for engagement, cooperation on global issues. Others say containment is the way to go, maybe through a stronger military presence. It's a tough call, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers.
It's a debate that really reflects those different schools of thought within international relations, doesn't it? Offensive realism being just one piece of the puzzle. We've also got another big perspective, liberalism, that offers a totally different take.
Liberalism. Okay, so if offensive realism paints this kind of, well, offensive picture of the world, states always fighting for power. Liberalism is more about cooperation and diplomacy, right?
Exactly. Liberalism emphasizes the potential for states to actually work together, even within this anarchic system we've been talking about.
So instead of this constant struggle for power, liberals see opportunities for countries to find common ground, maybe build institutions that can help them cooperate.
Right on. They believe that democracies, for example, are less likely to go to war with each other, and they see economic interdependence, where countries rely on each other for trade and investment, as a powerful force for peace.
So basically, the more interconnected we are, the less likely we are to fight.
That's the general idea. And liberals also point to the role of international organizations, like the United Nations, in facilitating dialogue and resolving disputes peacefully.
It's fascinating to see these two perspectives side by side. Offensive realism, with its emphasis on power and self-interest, and liberalism, with its focus on cooperation and institutions. Two very different ways of looking at how the world works.
Absolutely. And while they might seem contradictory, both offer valuable insights. No single theory can fully capture the complexities of international relations. The key is to consider multiple viewpoints and be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Couldn't agree more. Now, going back to Mearsheimer and offensive realism for a sec, he argues that the ultimate goal for a state isn't just survival, it's achieving hegemony.
Right. And he makes a distinction between global hegemony, which he sees as virtually impossible, and regional hegemony, a more attainable goal for powerful states.
Okay, so world domination is probably off the table, at least for now. But what about regional hegemony? Are there any real-world examples of that throughout history?
Well, Mearsheimer points to the U.S. as a prime example. He argues that the U.S. has achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere.
Makes sense. I mean, no other country in North or South America comes close to the U.S. in terms of military power.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of Mearsheimer's key concepts, the stopping power of water.
The stopping power of water.
Yeah, he highlights how large bodies of water, like oceans, act as natural barriers, making it really difficult to project power over long distances.
So geography is a major factor in the global balance of power. Who knew geography class would come in handy for understanding international relations?
You never know where those high school lessons will pop up again. And this concept of the stopping power of water also helps explain why the U.S., for much of its history, was able to pursue a strategy of offshore balancing.
Offshore balancing, right. That's where, instead of trying to dominate Europe or Asia directly, the U.S. kind of stayed back, intervening only when absolutely necessary.
Exactly. Stepping in to prevent a potential hegemon from emerging in those regions, a more cautious and arguably less costly approach than trying to control everything directly.
But is that still a viable strategy for the U.S. in today's world? I mean, with globalization and technology making the world more interconnected than ever, can the U.S. really afford to stay on the sidelines?
It's a question that's causing a lot of debate, especially with China's growing influence around the world.
Speaking of which, let's dig a little deeper into how states actually gain power, according to offensive realism. We've talked about balancing and buck passing, but what are some other strategies they might use?
Well, while offensive realism emphasizes military power as a key factor, it recognizes that states have a whole toolkit of strategies at their disposal. War is obviously the most drastic, but also the riskiest.
War. I gotta say, it seems counterintuitive that in the 21st century, with the threat of nuclear war hanging over us, war would still be considered a viable option.
It is a grim reality, but history unfortunately shows us that states still resort to war to achieve their objectives, despite the costs and risks. However, Mearsheimer points out that states can also gain power without actually fighting, through strategies like blackmail or what he calls bait and bleed.
Okay, hold on. Let's break those down. Blackmail, I assume, involves using threats to get what you want. Maybe the threat of military force to coerce another state into making concessions.
You got it. It's all about applying pressure, hoping to get your way without resorting to all-out war. Of course, it's not without its risks.
Right. If a state makes threats but doesn't follow through, it could damage its credibility, right?
Yeah,
Making other states less likely to take them seriously down the line.
exactly. Blackmail is a delicate game. Now, bait and bleed, that's a bit more, well, manipulative.
Bait and bleed, that sounds ominous.
It involves trying to provoke a war between two of your rivals, hoping they'll weaken each other in the process, and you can swoop in and benefit from the chaos.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky. It's like playing both sides against the middle, hoping to profit from their conflict.
It's not exactly playing by the rules, but Mearsheimer argues that it's a strategy that's been used throughout history and one that states need to be aware of.
So if we're looking at the world through the lens of offensive realism, it paints a pretty, well, dangerous picture. States constantly scheming, maneuvering for advantage, even if it means resorting to force or deception.
It's not exactly a rosy picture, is it? But it's important to remember it's a theory, a way of understanding how things might work, not a prediction of how things will definitely play out.
Right. It doesn't mean war is inevitable, but it does highlight the potential for conflict in a world where states are driven by those core concerns of security and the desire for power.
Exactly. It's about understanding those underlying motivations, not saying that conflict is the only outcome.
Okay, so understanding offensive realism doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us a framework, a way to analyze why states act the way they do, even when those actions might seem irrational or aggressive on the surface.
That's a great way to put it. It's a lens through which we can view the world, a way to understand the complex interplay of power, security, and self-interest that drives so many decisions on the global stage.
And speaking of the global stage, one of the biggest game changers in modern history have to be nuclear weapons. How does offensive realism account for the role of nukes in this whole power struggle?
Now, that's a fascinating question. You might think that nuclear weapons, with their immense destructive power, would completely change the rules of the game, right? Make the logic of offensive realism obsolete.
I mean, the threat of mutually assured destruction should make states think twice about starting any kind of conflict, right?
That's the common assumption, at least. But Mearsheimer, he actually argues that while nuclear weapons have certainly made war more dangerous, they haven't fundamentally changed the underlying dynamics of power politics.
Wait, so even with the risk of nuclear annihilation, states are still driven by those same desires for security and power?
That's his argument, yes. He points out that nuclear-armed states still engage in intense security competition, although it may take on different forms than before the nuclear age.
Right. Instead of massive land wars, we see things like proxy conflicts, arms races to develop even more sophisticated nuclear weapons, espionage, cyber warfare. The competition continues, just on a different playing field.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer argues that possessing nuclear weapons, while a powerful deterrent, doesn't guarantee security. States still worry about a potential nuclear attack, whether accidental or intentional, and they still seek advantages over their rivals, even in the nuclear realm.
It's a sobering thought that even the most destructive weapons ever created haven't fundamentally changed the nature of international relations. It really makes you wonder about the future.
It does, doesn't it? And that leads us to a crucial question. What does offensive realism tell us about that future? Are we headed for a world of more conflict and instability? Or is there some hope for a more peaceful, stable world order?
That's the big question on everyone's mind, right? What's next for the world? Is offensive realism just saying it's all doom and gloom, that conflict is inevitable?
Well, Mearsheimer, being a proponent of offensive realism, argues that the future will probably look a lot like the past, at least when it comes to the things that drive how countries interact on the world stage.
You mean like all that competition for power, security, and influence?
Exactly. He thinks the post-Cold War era, with its relative peace and stability, was kind of a fluke, a historical anomaly.
So he's saying we're headed back to a world that's a lot more competitive. A multipolar system where power is spread out and the risk of conflict is higher.
That's the gist of it. He sees things like the rise of China, Russia becoming more assertive, and all the conflicts happening around the world as signs that things are going to get a lot more turbulent and unpredictable.
And for the U.S., the current hegemon, that means facing some serious challenges to its dominance.
Exactly. He believes this competition for power could easily escalate into conflict, especially in places like East Asia, where China's ambitions are clashing with U.S. interests.
Okay, I gotta admit, that's a pretty sobering thought. But is there any way to break out of this cycle? Is it possible to find a balance between pursuing power and achieving peace?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Can countries feel secure without making others feel threatened?
Can they cooperate without having to give up their own interests?
These are the big questions that have been debated in international relations for ages. Offensive realism, focusing as it does on power and self-interest, doesn't necessarily offer a clean path to utopia, but it does make us grapple with the reality of how the world works.
It's a reality check. A reminder that power dynamics are real, that countries act in ways they think are best for them, even if it doesn't seem that way from the outside.
Right. And it means we have to be realistic about the challenges in building a more peaceful world. Understanding offensive realism doesn't mean being cynical or fatalistic.
It's about using that knowledge to make better decisions, come up with strategies, and try to make the world a bit more stable and secure.
Exactly. It's a tool for analysis, a way to anticipate potential problems, a starting point for thinking about how to move towards a more peaceful and cooperative world.
So, while it doesn't give us all the answers or a guaranteed roadmap to peace, it's a valuable framework for thinking about international relations. It's a way to kickstart a conversation about how to create a better world.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that offensive realism is just one perspective. Like we talked about earlier, liberalism provides a different lens, focusing on cooperation, the role of institutions, and finding common ground even when there's no global authority.
It's all about keeping an open mind, considering different viewpoints, and constantly learning.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive into offensive realism, I want to leave you with one last thought.
Hit me with it.
Mearsheimer argues that the pursuit of power is just how international relations works. Countries want to be secure and they want to be influential. But could it be that this constant pursuit of power is a self-fulfilling prophecy?
A self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't follow.
Think about it. If every country is always trying to become more powerful, won't that lead to what's called a security dilemma?
Security dilemma.
Yeah, it's the idea that when one country builds up its military, other countries feel threatened and do the same. It creates a spiral of tension and mistrust that could actually make conflict more likely, not less.
So a country trying to be safer might accidentally make things more dangerous for everyone.
That's the paradox, and it's something that offensive realism, with its focus on power and self-interest, struggles to fully address.
Makes you wonder if there's a different way to approach these issues, one that prioritizes cooperation and working together to create a system where everyone feels a bit safer.
Definitely worth thinking about. Maybe by understanding this security dilemma and the potential dangers of an unchecked pursuit of power, we can start imagining other ways forward. Ways to build a world where security isn't a zero-sum game.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. We've covered some serious ground today, exploring the ins and outs of offensive realism, what it gets right, where it might fall short, and what it means for the world today and tomorrow.
It's a theory that can be uncomfortable, that challenges our assumptions, but it can also help us make sense of the choices countries make and the forces that shape events on a global scale.
It's a reminder that power is important, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly. Offensive realism provides this framework for thinking about international relations. It's a tool for analysis, a way to think critically, and a reminder that while power matters, it's not the only thing that determines the course of history.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. The world of international relations is always changing, and there's always something new to discover.
And remember, knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about what shapes our world, the better prepared we'll be to face the challenges and opportunities that come our way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into offensive realism. Until next time, keep on diving.